All right, now that we finished sewing and screwing up the fabric for our nursing cover, we're going to work with the knit fabric. Remember, we needed a 9-inch wide strip of knit fabric. I'm using a Ponte knit that has about 10% stretch, so it's pretty stable. So I'm going to cut my strip to be 40 inches in length. So let's do that, and then we'll go to the next step. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to even up the selvage edge of the strip. So you can see if I line this up with the grid on the board, it's a little bit uneven here. So I'm just going to straighten that up by trimming off a little bit. Okay. All right, so now I know this is one of my good ends, so I'm going to flip it around like this, and I'm actually going to lay it on my board starting at 1, like this. And now I know that in order to get a 40-inch strip, all I have to do is trim it off right here at the 40. All right, so I'm just going to quickly trim this to 40 inches. Okay, oops. All right. Okay. All right, so now my strip is the length that I need. And the next step is we want to find the center, and we want to mark where we're going to attach this knit onto the top edge of the nursing cover. So basically, the easiest way for me to find the middle is to fold it in half. Okay, and so if I fold it in half, here's my middle. And I'm just going to mark the middle with a pin. Like this. All right, so now I've got it marked. All right, to make it easy to see, I'm going to mark the center of my strip with this chalk liner, so now you can see it. Okay, I folded my strip in half lengthwise, so you can see it's half as wide now. And I've got the mark for the center of my strip. And what I want to do now is I just want to mark the portion of this edge that we are not going to sew together when we make a knit tube, because I want to leave an opening that will allow me to stitch this knit tube to the top of our nursing cover. I'm going to measure a 16-inch opening that we're not going to sew when we sew this knit into a tube. And that will also make it really easy for us to turn it to the right side. So because this is my center, I'm just going to measure out 8 inches, and since I have it lined up with the board, I'm just going to count the blocks. So I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I'm going to make a mark. And I'm going to go this direction too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. So now I've got the amount I'm going to leave open when I sew. And the next step is to sew this knit strip into a tube. Okay, so I'm just going to stick in a few pins. I'm only going to be sewing from the mark to the end on both sides of my strip. So I'm just going to put a few pins in here to help hold it straight. Okay, and then I'm just going to pin from the mark on the other side to the opposite end. All right, and then I'm just going to pin one more time to hold it. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine. Okay, so I'm going to sew, starting at this end, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And when I'm working with a knit, I want to make sure I don't pop the stitches if I'm using my sewing machine. So I'm going to make my stitch length really short. So I'm going to set my stitch length to a 2.0. And the other thing I'm going to do to give it some stretch is I'm going to stretch it out as I sew it slightly. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently stretch and sew. So let me just start. And then as soon as I can, I'm going to put my finger behind to hold it, and I'm just going to gently stretch it a little bit, and I'm going to sew all the way to my first mark where I'm going to stop sewing and leave an opening. All right, so I'm just going to gently stretch that a little bit. I'm just holding it back slightly. Now I'm at my mark where I want to stop sewing, so I'm just going to back tack like that to tie it off. Then I'm going to cut my threads, and I'm going to just skip over to the other side of my opening over here, and I'm going to start by back tacking. And I'm going to stretch a little bit and sew all the way to this opposite end. Okay, I'm going to back tack. All right. All right, you can see that I've sewed my knit into a tube, and I've left an opening from here to here. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clip my seam allowance to, but not through my stitching line, like that. All right, let me do the other one. All right, so now I'm going to reach in and turn this to the right side. So the nice thing with working with a nice wide tube like this is it's easy to turn it to the right side. Now that we have finished our knit tube, let's put it aside and work on the fabric portion of our nursing cover. Remember, we already trued it up, so we know everything's going to match up when we sew. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to find the center, mark a 16-inch opening that will match the one that I just left in our knit tube, and then we're going to sew around the rest of the edges. So let's mark our top edge first, and then we'll sew around and turn it to the right side. I've got my the fabric portion of my nursing cover right sides together. You can see everything's lined up. And what I want to do is I want to quickly mark the 16-inch opening along the top edge of this so it will match up when I go to sew the knit to the top of this. So the first thing is I'm just going to make a mark in my center so you can see it. And then I'm going to count over 8 inches and I'm going to make a mark. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm going to make a mark right here. Okay, and then I'm also going to make 8 inches in the other direction. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to make it right here. Okay. So now I know I'm going to sew, I'm going to start sewing over here, and I'm going to stitch all the way around, down the lower edge, back up the side, around the corner, and I'm going to finish right here. So let's put in a few pins and go to the sewing machine. I'm going to pin my opening where it starts, and then I'll just pin a little bit over here. Let's pin down the side. And again, it's important, I'm just double checking where I made my strips match. I just want to make sure those are in agreement. And you can see that they are. Okay, so I just want to make sure that is matched up so it'll look nice and even when I turn it to the right side. All right, and then let's just put a couple in at the top and we'll be ready to go. Here's where I'm going to stop. Here's where I'm going to start sewing actually. And I'll just put one more in. All right, excellent. All right, so let's go to the sewing machine. I'm going to start sewing at my first, where my first pin was, right on the edge of my opening, and I'm sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to back tack, and I'm going to sew down to my first corner. Okay, now instead of pivoting and turning the corner, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stitch directly off the fabric, or directly to the end of the fabric, and then I'm gonna back tack a little bit. Then when I line up the side edge, I can be at a 1/2 inch, like that. And when I start stitching, I'm gonna back tack through my first line of stitching to sort of reinforce that corner. But you can see it makes a really easy corner because I'm not pivoting, and it also makes it easy for me to have an accurate seam allowance when I start working on the next side. So that's how I'm gonna stitch my corners, by stitching straight through. Okay, in this direction, my seam allowances are pointing down, so I know they're all gonna lay nice. When I go around the opposite side, I wanna make sure that I don't flip the seam when I stitch up and against it. So this side, it's easy. I'm just gonna stitch right across this seam allowance. Okay, and again, I'm gonna stitch right off the edge of the fabric. Or, I'm sorry, right to the edge of the fabric. Like that. Pick it up. Line up the 1/2 inch on the bottom edge. Back tack through the seam. And sew the bottom edge. Almost there. All right, here we are. Okay. Okay. So before I turn this to the right side, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to clip my corners so I can get a nice, sharp, defined point, nice edge when I turn it to the right side. And to clip my corner, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut straight across like this. And I'm not cutting through my intersection of where I back tacked, just probably within like a 1/16 of an inch. And then I'm also going to trim my seam allowance coming to the point as well on an angle like this. And that will help give me a nice crisp point when I turn my fabric to the right side. So let me just do the other 3 corners. Okay. Alright, so now I've trimmed my corners, and the other thing I want to do is I want to clip my seam allowance on the edges of the opening that I left so I can lay these seam allowances flat after they're turned as well. So I'm just going to do what I did to the knit. I'm just going to clip to but not through my stitching, like that. Let me do the other side. Okay. All right. All right, so now I'm going to turn this to the right side, and the only thing I'm going to mention about that is how I deal with my corners. Okay, sometimes I find that it helps if I help them along before I actually turn them to help them get a nice shape. So I'm going to reach into this corner, and I'm actually going to grab the fabric as close to that point as I can to turn. And then I'm going to poke through from the wrong side with my little point turner like this. So when I turn it, you can see that I've got a pretty good shape without even fussing with it very much. Alright, so I'm just going to turn my rest of my fabric to the right side, and I'm just going to poke my corners as I go. Okay. Alright, so now I can go in with my point turner and finesse the corners a little bit more. The one thing is, you don't want to push so hard that you make a hole in your corner of your fabrics. Remember, you trimmed it pretty close. So I'm just going to gently create a point.